transport. So active transport is very different from passive transport, and then active transport requires energy. And so before we get into talking about active transport of the types, it's important for you to understand how the cell membrane works. So this here is a bunch of pictures of the cell membrane, and the most important thing is to understand the cell membrane is considered a phospholipid bilayer. So we've learned that it controls what gets in and out, but we haven't learned how it controls what gets in and out, and that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of these slides. So it's called a phospholipid bilayer because you see these round circles, they represent the phosphate heads. These phosphate heads are considered hydrophilic, which means they attract water or they like water. And then the other part of the molecule, the other part of the membrane is the lipid tail. So phosphates here, and then the lipid tails are underneath that. And they call this a bilayer because there's two layers of it. One layer here, and you can see the white that separates one layer from the other layer below it. And what's interesting about this, that phospholipid bilayer, the fact that part of the molecule likes water, the heads, the phosphate heads, and part doesn't like water, the lipid tails, it makes the molecule arrange in a way where the phospholipids are always facing the environment. For instance, the phosphates on the outside and then the phosphates on the inside, they're always surrounding some kind of liquid and they like the water. Whereas the lipid tails are on the inside. And so the cell membrane is not locked together like a chain link fence. It's got these molecular bonds which hold it in place but don't necessarily join it completely. And that's important because we have to have the cell membrane be able to separate at times to allow things to come in and out. Besides having the phospholipid bilayer, you also have these protein channels. And we'll talk about the protein channels in just a minute, but that's how things get into and out of the cells, a majority of the solutes. So in diffusion, we learned how things travel in and out based on their concentration gradient. Things move from high concentration to low concentration and can pass easily if they're small enough through a protein channel. So that's one type of diffusion. It doesn't require any energy. However, there are other times when we want to take things and we want to physically move them from one side to the other. And so what happens in these kinds of protein channels is that it changes shape. So you can see there's a solute here, and you can see this protein has a shape that allows an opening on this side, but is closed on the other side. And we'll call this area the inside of the cell here, and we'll call this area the outside of the cell for now. So these solutes can go into the cell, and if they have the right shape based on the lock and key model, right, a lock and key model, it means they have complementary shapes, it will cause the protein, along with the input of energy, to change shape. And it changes shape in such a way that it closes the door to the outside and opens the door to an inside to allow that solute that it just captured to be transported in. Here's another look at that, and you can see how, again, the protein has a shape, a normal shape, and these solutes are able to come inside that entrance. And when they have the complementary shape, the lock and key, they can cause the protein to change shape. But it requires the use of energy. The energy in cellular work is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it causes the molecule to change shape, the protein. And so you can see the door is closed on the outside, but a door is opened on the inside, which allows that solute to come in. And immediately upon this happening, as soon as this is released, what will happen is the protein will change back to its original shape. So the door closes on the inside and opens back to the outside. And you can see if this happened over and over and over again, you could quickly move all of this solute material from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So active transport means that it requires energy. So in most cases, when you're moving things in a cell, you're moving it against the concentration gradient. If this was a normally open channel, these materials, because we have a high concentration here, would move directly through those channels to where the area of lower concentration is. We don't need energy for that. That's diffusion. That's for free. In this case, though, we want to get the material that's out here, even though it's in low concentration, we want to get that inside the cell. And so what happens is it's like pushing a rock uphill. The rock wants to be down at the bottom, but you don't want it there. So in order to get it to the top, you're going to have to push it up there and use energy. So here's a real-world example of that happening. You can see that here's your phospholipid bilayer, and this protein doorway or protein channel. And you can see a bunch of sodium atoms or sodium ions and potassium ions, and then ATP, which becomes ADP when the energy is used. So you don't have to know all the complicated intricacies of how this happens, but understand that this is what happens in your muscles. You need to move this sodium and this potassium to different sides of the cell membrane to cause muscle contractions. Okay, so when you contract your muscles, you're expending energy. We know that if you've ever exerted your muscles in such a way where you got exhausted, right? You either get tired, but you can physically start to feel your muscles. And when they get really tired, you can feel that lactic acid build up because there's not enough oxygen to make the energy, and the energy is required to make those muscles contract, right? And they contract because the energy is being used to pump these ions to different parts of the membrane to create different electrical voltage differences so that we can do this or run or do any kind of muscle movement. So another type of way that things can move into and out of the cells is by using vesicles. If you notice the vesicles look like phospholipids. They are exactly made of phospholipids. In the endoplasmic reticulum, if it's the rough endoplasmic reticulum, you're processing proteins. In the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, you're processing lipids. These lipids and proteins are sent to the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi creates these packages and puts the proteins in the middle. Now, this kind of movement, vesicle movement, is usually associated with with much larger pieces of solute or larger molecules that you want to move in and out of cell membranes. So when a vesicle moves into a cell, it's called endocytosis. Endo meaning in, cytosis having to do with the cell. And when it wants to move things out of a cell, it's called exocytosis. Exo, like exit. And then cytosis, again, cell. So let's take a look. If you have materials outside of a cell, like here, and you want to move those materials in, when these materials come in contact with the cell membrane recognizes that this is material it wants inside the cell will start to indent, and eventually the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, will surround those materials and pinch off, and now you have a vesicle which can now transport materials throughout the cell. In exocytosis, much the same way, except this vesicle was probably made by the Golgi apparatus, and these are probably the proteins processed through the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and now we want to export this from the cell. So this phospholipid bilayer simply gravitates and travels to the outside of the cell. It merges with the cell membrane, expelling its contents to the outside. And this happens over and over and over again. And the last thing I want to say about all of these different types of transport is that they're very much a huge, if not probably the predominant part of your metabolism. Your metabolism is the sum of all your chemical processes, and a large majority of that is what's happening at the cellular level. We're using these little solutes, these chemicals and things to communicate with cells. You're either importing things through protein channels, exporting them through protein channels, or you're creating vesicles to transport things into and out of the cell. And one of the biggest examples of this is the neuron, which are your nerve cells pictured here, where we receive chemicals from lots of different cells and then transport electrical messages because of the different types of transports that happen here to be able to extend down the length of the cell. So this is predominant what happens in your nerve cells and allows you to respond and react to situations in your world. And that's it. Hope it was helpful.